He did not know he was a ghost. He did not know that the world below the cloud layer had already written his obituary, or that the books of men had already begun to speak of his kind in the past tense. He only knew the mist, the damp chill of the high-altitude rainforest, and the silence that had grown, year after year, like a choking vine around his heart. He was the last Mohobracatesta Kauaʻi, perched on the moss-lick branch of a twisting Heialehua tree. He was a creature of striking, regal contrast. His feathers were a deep, glossy black, smooth as obsidian, save for the brilliant, shocking yellow tufts that adorned his thighs, like the robes of a forgotten emperor. His eyes, sharp and pale yellow, scanned the dense canopy of the Alaka Wilderness Preserve. It was 1987. The world outside this remote crater on the island of Kauai, it was loud with traffic, politics, and human expansion. But here, nearly 4,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, the world was shrinking. The bird shifted his weight. The wind bit through his plumage, carrying the scent of rain and rot. In the days of his ancestors, this forest had been a cacophony of sound. The were the noisy lords of the canopy, their voices weaving a tapestry of whistles, flute-like trills, and rhythmic calls that echoed off the canyon walls. They were aggressive, vibrant, and alive. They chased each other through the ferns. They defended their nectar sources with furious energy. They sang duets that spiraled into the sky, a male and a female weaving their voices so tightly that they sounded like a single spirit. Now, the wind only carried the sound of dripping water. He fluffed his feathers against the cold. He was old. His movements were slower than they had been in the seasons of his youth. But the instinct was timeless. It burned in his chest, a biological imperative that ignored the reality of his isolation. It was the season. The air pressure was right. The light filtering through the gray clouds was right. It was time to find her. She must be here, his instincts whispered. She is just over the ridge, just beyond the mist. He hopped to a higher branch, his black talons gripping the rough bark. He looked for the flash of yellow in the green gloom. He listened for the soft, answering chirp that would signal a female was nearby, foraging for nectar in the lobelia flowers. He remembered her. Or perhaps he remembered the idea of her. It had been years since he had seen another of his kind. The last time he had heard a response, it had been faint, a dying echo that he had chased for miles until his wings burned, only to find an empty tree swaying in the breeze. The forest had changed, too. It wasn't just the silence, there was a sickness in the air. The lower elevations were swarming with small, buzzing demons mosquitoes. They brought a fire in the blood that had killed his parents, his siblings, and his rivals. The pigs, heavy and destructive, rooted through the forest floor, turning the crystal-clear streams into mud and destroying the undergrowth where the young once hid. The rats, distinct and invasive, climbed the trees at night, seeking eggs. He had survived them all. He had retreated higher and higher up the mountain into the cold, wet sanctuary of the Alaka, where the mosquitoes were too cold to fly. He was the survivor, the victor, but victory felt terrifyingly like a prison. Hunger gnawed at him. He took flight, a flash of black and yellow against the gray sky. He flew with a desperate grace, banking between the ferns and the koa trees. He found a cluster of tubular flowers, their petals bright and promising. He landed, inserting his curved beak to sip the nectar. It was sweet, giving him a burst of energy, but it didn't satisfy the other hunger, the hollowness in his chest. He paused, nectar dripping from his beak, and looked out over the vast, green expanse of the crater. The fog was rolling in, a white wall erasing the world. Sing, the ancient code in his DNA commanded. If you sing, she will come. It was the law of his existence. Sound was the bridge. If he remained silent, he did not exist. If he remained silent, the lineage that stretched back millions of years, before humans ever walked the earth, would snap. He cleaned his beak on the branch. He primed his yellow-legged feathers, ensuring he looked magnificent for the audience that wasn't there. He puffed out his chest. The forest held its breath. The other birds, the apapane and the iwai, seemed to fade into the background. They knew, in their own animal way, that the king was about to speak. He opened his beak and let out a test note, a sharp, clear whistle. Tweet. It pierced the damp air, traveling through the moss and the leaves. He cocked his head, listening. Silence. The silence was not passive. It was aggressive. It swallowed his note instantly. It was a void that demanded to be filled, yet refused to give anything back. He felt a flicker of anxiety, a bird-sized panic fluttering in his ribs. Maybe he wasn't loud enough. Maybe the wind had carried his voice away from her. He needed to go higher. He needed to be louder. He flew to the dead snag of a koa tree, the highest point in his territory. The mist swirled around him, isolating him in a white room. He was a singular point of life in a universe of gray. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his breath. He was the last guardian of a language that was about to vanish. When he opened his eyes, he didn't see the tragedy. He saw only the hope of the call. He prepared to sing the full song, not just a call, but the mating ballad, the duet. He did not know that miles away, wading through the mud and tangles of the swamp, strange, hairless apes were carrying silver boxers and long black ears, hunting for him. He did not know they were coming to steal his soul onto magnetic tape. All he knew was that he was alone, and he could not bear it. The Alaka Wilderness Preserve did not welcome visitors. It tolerated them with a damp, cold indifference. Down below, on the human plane of existence, it was a humid Tuesday. But up here, trudging along the rotting wooden planks of the boardwalk that snaked through the swamp, it felt like walking on the spine of a sleeping, waterlogged beast. Dr. David Harrison wiped the condensation from his glasses for the 10th time that hour. He paused, his boots sinking an inch into the sucking mud where the boardwalk had splintered and failed. His breath plumed in the air, a white ghost escaping his lips. Behind him, his assistant Sarah adjusted the heavy strap of the equipment bag. Inside that bag sat a Nagra reel-to-reel tape recorder, the finest audio equipment 1987 had to offer, and a burden that grew heavier with every mile they climbed. "Are we close?" Sarah whispered. Her voice was thin, swallowed instantly by the dense wall of ohia trees and hapu ferns. David checked his map. Tug Editin. T. Really needed. He knew this terrain. He knew the specific ridges where the wind died down enough to hear the faint rustle of feathers. "We're entering the zone," he murmured, keeping his voice low, reverent. The last sighting was near the stream bed, past the ridge. Step lightly. They weren't hunters, yet they stalked with a predator's intensity. They were ornithologists, scientists of the dying. They had come not to save the king of the Alakifor. They knew, with the heavy, leaden certainty of science, that he could not be saved but to archive him. They were the undertakers of a species. The mission was grim. Te Kauaʻi was functionally extinct. The term was a dry, academic way of saying walking dead. Without a female, the genetic line was already severed. The bird they were looking for was merely a lingering echo, a biological footnote refusing to fade. "I hate this," Sarah said suddenly, her voice cracking. She stopped, leaning against a mossy trunk. "I feel like we're vultures." David looked back at her. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, but also the sorrow. It filled it too. "We aren't vultures, Sarah. We're witnesses. If we don't get this on tape, if we don't capture his voice, then in 50 years, no one will believe he sounded like this. He'll just be a drawing in a book. We owe him his history." She nodded, swallowing hard, and hefted the recorder again. "De ipuset on." The forest grew darker as the mist thickened. It was a vague volcanic smog mixed with mountain fog that turned the world into a grayscale photograph. The silence was profound. In a healthy rainforest, the air should have been vibrating with insect noise, with the chirps of honey creepers. But the invasive mosquitoes and the avian malaria they carried had swept through here like a plague. The silence was the sound of a graveyard. Suddenly, David froze. He held up a hand, a sharp, rigid command to stop. Sarah froze mid-step, one boot hovering over a puddle. Whistle. It was faint, sharp. 2 notes, clear as a bell, cutting through the damp air. David's heart hammered against his ribs. It was unmistakable. It sounded nothing like the other birds, not the rasp of the amakihi, or the trill of the apipane. This sound was ancient. It carried the timbre of a woodwind instrument carved from the bones of the earth. "Did you hear that?" David mouthed, barely making a sound. Sarah's eyes were wide. She nodded. They moved now, with agonizing slowness. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. David unslung his binoculars, scanning the canopy. The gray mist made it impossible to see colors. Everything was a silhouette. Whistle. Chirp. Louder this time. "E was close." David pointed. High up in a dead koa snag, about 50 yards away, a shape moved. It was small, agile, hopping from one bare branch to another with a frantic, nervous energy. Through the lenses, the bird sprang into focus. David felt a lump form in his throat. The bird was magnificent and tragic. The black feathers gleamed even in the dull light, and the yellow leg tufts were bright shocks of color, like royal insignia. The bird looked healthy, strong, and utterly, devastatingly alone. "Get the nagra," David whispered. "Now." Slowly. Sarah lowered the bag to the wet moss. Her hands trembled as she unzipped the case. The smell of ozone and electronics wafted up, alien in this primeval forest. She threaded the magnetic tape through the heads, her fingers working with practiced muscle memory despite her nerves. She donned the heavy headphones. Flipping the switch, the reels began to spin. "Were?" David held up the shotgun microphone, aiming it like a weapon at the tree. He watched the needles on the recorder jump as the wind hit the mic. "Rolling," Sarah whispered. The bird on the branch paused. He cocked his head, looking down. The king of the Silent Kingdom had spotted the intruders. David held his breath. Had they spooked him? Would he fly away, vanishing into the mist for another year? The bird stared right at them with pale, intelligent eyes. He didn't seem afraid. He seemed expectant. The bird shifted, puffing out his throat feathers. He didn't see two humans with machines. He saw an audience. Or perhaps, in his desperation, he simply saw living things that might, just might, be able to hear him. He's going to sing, David realized. The thought hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He's setting up for the duet. The tragedy of the moment washed over David. He knew the biology of the OOU. They were duet singers. The male would sing a phrase, and the female would instantly respond, their voices interlocking so perfectly that it sounded like one continuous stream of sound. It was a conversation, a dance, a bond. The bird opened his beak, tetep spoon. The world went still. And the last male on Earth prepared to ask a question to a world that had no answer. The tape rolled. The magnetic wheels turned with a soft, hypnotic rhythm, counting down seconds that could never be up in the tray. The king prepared his throat. He did not know he was performing for a machine. He felt the phantom presence of a mate that existed only in his memory. He felt the phantom pressure of millions of years of evolution, where the only thing that mattered, only thing that kept the darkness at bay was the song. Began. It started with a low, throaty warble, a sound like water bubbling over smooth stones. Then he launched into the call. It was a complex, flute-like melody, piercing and sweet. It rose in pitch, a question asked of the universe. Whistle-00-wheat-000. And then he stopped. This was the tragedy that broke Sarah's heart as she watched the audio levels bounce on the Nagra recorder. Te Kauaʻi, yud not sin solos. They sung in interlocking parts. The male would sing a phrase, and the female would slot her voice perfectly into the pause, creating a continuous, weaving melody. The bird on the branch stood frozen, his beak slightly open. He was listening. He was leaving the space for her. He was giving her the stage. Silence. The pause stretched. 1 second. 2 seconds. The wind rustled the leaves of the jai tree. A distant drop of water fell onto a fern. But from the forest, there was no answer. No female voice rose to meet him. No sweet chirp filled the gap he had lovingly carved out for her. He did not despair immediately. He was patient. Perhaps she was shy. Perhaps she was eating. He sang the next phrase, a higher, more urgent trill. To eat? Again. He paused. He cocked his head to the side, his yellow eyes wide and searching. He stared into the gray wall of mist, waiting for the counter-melody. Silence. Down on the boardwalk, David lowered the microphone slightly. His arms aching, his vision blurring with tears he refused to wipe away. He was recording a conversation with a ghost. The pauses in the song were louder than the notes themselves. Those gaps were where the species used to be. Those gaps were the shape of extinction. The bird sang again. And again, he poured his energy into the humid air. He fluffed his yellow feathers, dancing along the branch, turning this way and that to project his voice into every corner of the valley. I am here, the song said. I am strong. I have territory. I am waiting. The recording tape captured it all. It captured the beauty of the notes and the crushing, heavy weight of the silence that followed each one. It was a duet sung by one. After 10 minutes, the bird slowed down. The frantic energy began to ebb, replaced by a confused lethargy. He hopped to a lower branch. He let out one last, soft chirp, not a song, but a check. Anyone? The forest gave him nothing but the sound of the wind. The king preened his wing, tucking his head down. The performance was over. The audience of one had failed to appear. Cut it, David whispered, his voice thick. Sarah flipped the switch. The reels stopped spinning. The click of the machine sounded violent in the quiet forest. They had it. They had the voice. But as they packed the equipment in somber silence, they both knew they had stolen something intimate. They had recorded a plea that was never meant for human ears, a love letter that would never be read by its recipient. The humans left. They took their silver boxers and their heavy footsteps back down the mountain, leaving the Alaka wilderness to its ancient, rotting quiet. The bird remained. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The seasons shifted subtly. The rain became colder. The storms from the Pacific grew more violent, shaking the trees and ripping the moss from the bark. The bird followed his routine. Routine was the only thing that made sense. He woke before dawn, shaking the dew from his black feathers. He flew his patrol route, marking his territory. He chased away a wandering apapane that got too close to his favorite nectar tree, driving the smaller red bird away with a fierce hiss. He was still the king. He still held the land. But the silence was changing him. He sang less often now. The biological imperative was still there, burning like a small pilot light in his chest, but the lack of reinforcement was dimming it. Why sing when the world never sings back? He began to spend long hours sitting motionless on the high snag of the dead koa tree. It was the highest point in his world. From there, he could see the ocean of clouds below. He would sit there, a small black silhouette against the gray sky, watching. He was waiting for a flash of yellow. He was waiting for a movement that wasn't the wind. Sometimes he hallucinated. A yellow leaf falling from a tree would catch his eye, and his heart would leap, and he would dive from his perch, wings tucked, rushing toward the falling leaf with a desperate chirp. But as he neared, the leaf would hit the mud, dead and still, and he would land beside it, confused, poking it with his beak, before flying back up to his post. His feathers began to lose their luster. The brilliant yellow thigh tufts, once groomed to perfection to attract a mate, grew slightly ragged. He wasn't eating enough. The nectar in the lobelia flowers was sweet, but the effort to find it seemed harder each day. The loneliness was a physical weight. Birds are social creatures. They exist in a web of calls, warnings, and acknowledgments. Without that web, his reality was fraying. He was forgetting who he was. Was there a bird, or was he just a piece of the mountain, like the rocks and the moss? One afternoon, a heavy storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind screamed through the canyons. Other birds took shelter deep in the ferns. But the Kauaʻi stayed on his branch a moment too long, calling out into the thunder. Tear. The thunder clapped back, drowning him out. He wasn't fighting for a mate anymore. He was fighting for his existence. He was shouting at the storm, demanding that the universe acknowledge him. I am still here. But the storm didn't care. The wind knocked him from the branch, tumbling him into the darkness of the canopy below. He caught himself, gripping a wet leaf, shivering uncontrollably. He huddled there as the rain hammered down, his eyes closing, the cold seeping into his hollow bones. He dreamt of the time before. He dreamt of the chorus. In his sleep, the forest was loud again. The end did not come with a bang. It did not come with a predator's jaws or a hunter's gun. Extinction, in the end, was quiet. It was simply the running down of a clock. It was late 1987, or perhaps early 1989. Time had lost its meaning to the bird. He was very old now. His joints ached when the pressure dropped. The flight to the nectar flowers was a marathon. He spent most of his time huddled in the hollow of a niaea tree, conserving warmth. The hurricane was coming. The air pressure dropped so low it felt like the sky was pressing down on the earth. The other animals sensed it. The rats scurried into deep holes. The pigs moved to the valleys. The king stayed. He was too tired to move. He sat on a low branch, his breathing shallow. The forest was eerily still, the calm before the violence. He looked around his kingdom one last time. He saw the mist threading through the trees. He saw the red blossoms of the jaya looking like drops of blood on the green leaves. He felt a tightening in his chest, a flutter. His heart, which had beaten millions of times, which had powered flights through storms and sun, was stuttering. He closed his eyes. In the darkness, behind his eyelids, the silence finally broke. He heard it, clear as a bell. Chioet. It was a female's call. It was air. His eyes snapped open. He lifted his head, strength flooding back into his frail body for one fleeting second. He knew it was in his mind, but it felt so real. She was calling him. She was just there, beyond the veil of the mist, waiting for him to finish the song. He puffed his chest out. He summoned the very last breath in his small lungs. He needed to answer. He needed to complete the duet. He opened his beak. TW. The sound died in his throat. His grip on the branch loosened. Gravity, which he had defied for a lifetime, finally claimed him. He fell, a small bundle of black and yellow feathers, tumbling softly through the air. He hit the soft bed of moss on the forest floor. He did not move. His eye, the color of a pale moon, stared up at the canopy one last time. Then the light faded. The eye glazed over. The heart stopped. At that exact moment, a lineage that had survived the ice ages, the rise of humans, and the shifting of continents, ended. Kauai. EU was gone. The forest did not mourn. The rain began to fall, washing over the black feathers, slowly claiming the body back into the earth. The silence he left behind was absolute. It was a hole in the soundscape of the planet that would never be filled again. Epilogue years later, in a university archive, a student pressed a button on a digital player Wisilo Wiju. The sound played through the speakers. A clear, haunting call. Silence. The student listened to the gap. The pause where the female should have been. The recording played on, preserving the ghost of the bird who sang for a love that no longer existed. The bird was dead. The species was dust. But the song Aakhri Pukaar, a digital phantom haunting the world of men, reminding them of the terrible, heavy costs of silence.